Alright, hello again everybody. So our lesson today is slavery in the South. So we're going to be taking a look at what the life of slave was like, what the culture of slavery was in the southern region of the United States. So our objectives and standards to explain why slavery increased in the South and to analyze the elements of slave life and culture. And please read the standards there. And our desired result. How would you describe the life and culture of slaves in the South? So you can kind of see a picture here, a painting of what slavery was like in the South, what life was like for slaves on plantations a little bit, see some of the things that they're working and doing. So hopefully that gives you kind of an idea to what we'll be talking about today. So cotton. Westward expansion, so the country is going to move kind of off the east coast a little bit more and more westward, right, to the middle of the country. And new technologies, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, transformed the United States by the early 1800s. Now, life is going to revolve around agriculture and cash crops. Cash crops are items or some type of material or product that's sold for money. And in this case, in the South, it's going to be cotton. So picking picking cotton seeds from cotton was hard. But this gentleman right here, Eli Whitney, is going to come up with an invention called the cotton gin that's going to change that. So how the cotton gin worked is you'd put the cotton in the machine, and these little rollers have like spikes or beads on them almost, and it would separate the seeds from the cotton and make this soft, fresh, material so you could sell to make clothing or fabric or whatever. So the machine is going to make large-scale cotton production possible. Obviously, the machine can separate the cotton quicker, so people don't have to pick it by hand and sort through all those tiny seeds. But the problem with this is that it's also going to increase the demand for labor, for slave labor in particular. So the cotton boom and slavery. America's most valuable crop soon became cotton. So farmers in the South are going to ship cotton to the North and to Europe to be processed into, like I said on the previous slide, clothing and fabrics and other types of material like that. So the Southern economy will become really based on cotton by the mid-1800s. So cotton requires a large amount of labor, so slavery will increase as well. By 1840, there will be nearly 2.5 million slaves in the United States. And that should be capitalized there. Sorry about that. Most white slave owners had about 5 slaves. And I remember a lot of people in the South may not have owned slaves in general, but if they did have a smaller farm or smaller land, they had maybe about 5 slaves, while plantation owners, like you saw in that big picture there in the beginning of our lesson here, they could have over 20 slaves. So the expansion of the slave trade. Slave traders are going to begin to meet the demands of these slave owners during the antebellum period. The antebellum period is the time before the Civil War, and slave traders are going to meet this in different ways. If you remember from our lesson a couple of lessons ago, the foreign trade deadline for slaves was quickly approaching the 20-year deadline. So during the Constitution, the founders of the Constitution of our government decided that the slave trade, the foreign slave trade, must end within 20 years. And that was quickly approaching by 1808, 1807. On January 1st of that year, in 1808, the ban on foreign slave trade goes into effect. So the United States will no longer be involved in the foreign slave trade, bringing slaves from Africa. But smuggling of slaves and from other places will still exist. Meanwhile, the U.S. domestic sale, so even though the foreign slave trade is still is closed, domestic sale trade of slaves is going to continue. So, for example, slave markets are going to exist in many places, such as Baltimore, Maryland, Charleston, South Carolina, and even Washington, D.C. So what this means is that, no, you can't bring slaves over from Africa anymore, but if you want to keep trading slaves from Georgia to Alabama, or from Mississippi to Maryland, or wherever, that's okay. So the work of slaves. Lives of slaves centered around work on rural farms and plantations. So again, southern economy based on agriculture, based on cotton. So a lot of slaves are going to be involved in working on farms or plantations. Uh, Sometimes the slaves would work alongside the owner on small farms doing various jobs, maybe plowing a field, maybe fixing the barn, whatever the case, taking care of the livestock, whatever the case may be. For plantations, the owners really didn't get involved in that. Plantations usually had overseers who were in charge of the slaves, and a lot of times these overseers were cruel and used punishments to punish slaves, such as whippings or beatings, or things like that. Now, plantation work was more difficult than, say, working on a small farm and painting a barn, right? Picking cotton was hard. You were pretty much out in the field from sun up to sundown, hot sun all day, very little break. And plantation work also could involve specific jobs. They also worked 6 days a week typically, and they had very few holidays. So here's a picture of, or an example of cotton pickers at work on a southern plantation. So you can see the slaves here picking the cotton. You can see how they have to kind of put it in these big wicker baskets or whatever they are. But again, then they have these bags that they can put the cotton in as well. And this gentleman here on the horse, he would be the overseer. So he's pretty much keeping an eye on the slaves, making sure they're working, making sure they're not taking too many breaks. And again, he probably had a whip on him. I don't know if he has a whip there or not, but sometimes they had a whip that they could whip the slaves if they felt they weren't doing a quick enough job or they were taking too long, whatever the case may be. So, the lives of Southern slaves. Slaves typically lived in pretty basic cabins with pretty simple clothes. They were given small food rations, and many, even after working in the hot sun or the field all day, had to care for not only themselves, but maybe their children, maybe a parent, maybe they had an elderly parent that was still a slave that, they have to help and take care of, or they had to help take care of each other. Now, there were also slaves who were sometimes placed inside the planter's household, such as butlers, nurses, or cooks. And you might say, well, that's pretty good. That's better than working in the field all day. And in some cases, yes, it was, but in other cases, not so much, because slaves who worked inside their owner's home did have better food and shelter, but they were forced to work 24 hours a day. So if you were a butler slave, you were pretty much at the beck and call of your owner at 2 o'clock in the morning, at 6 o'clock at night, at 10 o'clock at night. They were on call all the time. So the culture of Southern slaves. So all this work, whether it be inside the home or outside the home, for comfort, slaves are going to turn to different activities and to their families as well. Another big key factor of slave culture in the South was religion, which religion provided hope to them, that maybe they would be free one day, that maybe, there was some type of good coming for them. And slaves were sometimes allowed to gather and worship with slave preachers. These were people who were slaves who would come maybe from another plantation and preach to them, or they would be one of their own slave members. But spirituals or emotional songs that express religious beliefs about freedom or ending slavery or the joy of heavenly things or whatever the case may be using religion. They were used to express joy and sorrow. And another thing is that celebrations were used to, and services for that matter, were also a time for slaves to socialize, to talk, and to also preserve their culture as well. Excuse me. So slave families. Another important aspect of slave life was family. So religion plays a big role, and family also plays a big role. Very important to slave culture in the South. Slave marriage was also very common throughout the South, and owners are going to encourage marriage since they believed a slave was less likely to run away from their family or to rebel, since maybe punishment would be taken against his wife or children or whoever. So slaves, were encouraged to marry. But even though they were encouraged to get married, some slave families faced many difficulties. For example, owners could dissolve or separate a marriage. They could say, hey, you're not married anymore, things like that. There was also very little time for parents to care for their children. And a lot of times children would be forced to be, children were slaves as well. So they were forced to work in the field or maybe work in the house doing different roles. And owners were also very free to sell or separate families at any time. So obviously a very emotional thing to go through and a terrifying thing to go through. Having your wife or husband or children sold from you, that could happen any moment, any time, any day. All right, so our closure. How would you describe the life and culture of slaves in the South? What are they working at? How are they living their lives? What are they doing to keep that African culture alive? And that will help you answer your question. All right, I hope you have a great rest of your day or night, and hope to talk to you soon.